Thank you, he says in time on tradition, for being on. I've been asked to talk about risk registers, and I'm going to do that because I'm high compliance and well behaved. But like any good consultant, I'm going to sort of slightly challenge the brief in that risk registers are an important part of risk management, but they're only one part of it. So I'm going to sort of sandwich the practical stuff around risk registers between a little bit of stuff on definitions, because I think language is really, really important in a practical sense. And then if time allows, I'm going to do a little bit about best practice, because a lot of risk and issues management and crisis comms is as much about your attitude and mindset as it is about the tools and techniques. So I will do what I've been asked to do, but with a little bit extra as a sort of, a good consulting bonus buy, as we all do. So I will quickly share my slides if they are made available to me on my screen. Here we go. Right. So can you see some slides? I'm going to put it in present mode. Can you see an RC on screen? You got?
Yes, we can, Rod. Yeah, we can.
Brilliant. Okay, so today I've called today to risk registers and beyond, managing committee reputation, because I know this is about all of the different committees and groups and networks. What I'm going to cover off, as I say, is a little bit about introduce myself quickly. We're going to talk about definitions. The meat is going to be around risk registers, what they are, why you have them, and how they work. Then a little bit about key principles and best practice, and then if time allows, which it probably won't, a little bit of stuff on context from a report that I do every year called Reputation, Risk and Resilience, but we'll only do that if time allows. I would stress, as everyone says at the beginning of every session, I don't want this to be a one-way lecture and a monologue. I want you to ask questions, because this isn't about me downloading knowledge. This is about you becoming more practically empowered in this space. So hit me with questions all the way through, and I'm obviously happy to take questions at the end. Who am I? Advita kindly asked me to say that. So basically, I've been doing this for 3 decades, mainly in agency, lots of it in big global agencies. Last 5 years, I've been an independent. I'm way too involved with a whole load of industry bodies, PRCA, CIPR. I don't chair, terrible, I've just promoted myself. I'm special advisor to the Crisis Communications Network on the committee alongside Sarah, visiting fellow at Cardiff, and as we were discussing at the top of the call, the co-founder of the Independent Impact 50, launched last week. So that's 30 years in about 30 seconds, sorts of crisis stuff that I've done, but this isn't about me, this is about risk registers. So before we dive into risk registers, I'm going to hit you with a question, because this is ultimately all about managing risk, issues and crises. So a little bit of interactivity here. If I say the word crisis to you, let's play some word association. What words do you associate with the word crisis? Hit me up with your instantaneous reactions to the word crisis.
Reputation.
Okay. Keep them coming.
Being prepared.
Words, phrases. Sorry, Sarah?
Being prepared.
Being prepared. Nice.
Friday afternoon.
Yeah, nice. Good. Any more?
Chaos.
There we go. So someone fell into the trap. That's very good. So the point of asking the question is that I think that the word crisis is generally used in a very specific way in day-to-day language, which tends to mean a disaster, a catastrophe. Usually it's the idea of being an end point, the culmination of something. And that's, I'm afraid to say, kind of slightly wrong. This is how we think of the word crisis. But the word crisis properly defined, and I'm going to go bookish on you for a second, but only because it's practically relevant, is that the word crisis properly defined is not actually about an automatic disaster or catastrophe. It comes from a Greek word meaning decision, choice, or judgment. In The Mandarin symbol for crisis consists of the symbols for danger and opportunity. And the first time it was ever used in the English language, it was meant to mean the point in a disease which decides whether the patient recovers or deteriorates. And the reason I'm banging on about definitions is because if you go into a crisis assuming that it's going to be a disaster and that your job is to manage downside risk, then you will behave in a certain way. If you go in knowing that there is potentially as much opportunity as there is risk, depending on how you go in, how you behave and act, and how you recover, then your mindset is completely different. A bit of empirical data on this. There was a big study around 20 years ago by a company called Oxford Metrica who looked at the share price impact of around 200 mass fatality events and found that, unsurprisingly, companies who did badly in the teeth of a crisis, who responded poorly, saw an average 15% hit on their share price in the next 6 months. But those who were deemed to have done well actually saw a 5% uptick in their net stock value over the same period. So I'm just trying to lay down a fundamental principle that crisis doesn't mean disaster, and it can contain as much opportunity as it does risk. Quick thing on definitions. Ultimately, a crisis is usually defined as something that is of such a magnitude that it could impact the organization's reputation and then, crucially, the ability to operate normally. We talk in crisis comms about business as usual. And the point of a lot of crisis comms is to get back to BAU as quickly as possible. My definition in parallel with that is slightly different, is that for me it's ultimately all about human outcomes. So it's a human experience with human consequences that requires a human response based on human empathy. There is a difference, and this is crucial for all of you, a difference between issues and crises. An issue is any development which, if it continues, could lead to significant impact on finances, operations, reputation, or future interests. And so many crises are simply issues that have been poorly handled, ignored, or underplayed. The way that a colleague used to describe it, which I loved, is that in work as in life, we all have issues circulating beneath the surface. Very often, whether those become existential is actually down to us and our ability to foresee and manage those issues circulating beneath the surface. And the final thing that I'll leave you with is that we all use language very interchangeably. People tend to talk about threat, risk, vulnerability, incident, and crisis as if they were all the same thing. And that's a little ready reckoner about what the difference is between those different bits of language, because I think, again, both attitudinally and practically, it's really important that you manage risk in a way that is based on a good understanding of all those different bits of very important language, all interrelated, but not actually the same thing. So that was a quick intro. Any questions on the sort of definitions piece? Is there anything, I'm going to stop sharing for a second, anything there where you go, oh, I didn't know that, Rod, or oh, I fundamentally disagree? Any questions on the definitions piece?
I think what's really interesting, Rod, is that breakdown in that table, because you're right, people do mix up the language and the words around it. So having that clear definition, and I love that infographic, that graphic you showed of the shark swimming underneath around the issue, and when it actually does turn into a crisis, I think that's a really easy way to kind of remember that issues do exist. It's whether they turn into a crisis or not. Is up to you on how you do that. So yeah, I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Couldn't agree more. Amen. Okay, so let's dive back in and talk about the very exciting risk register, which is what I was actually asked to come and talk about. So, so what is a risk register and why have one? So a risk register is basically a tool that helps you to be systematic in the way that you identify, assess, and manage risk. And at the same time, it serves as a central repository for capturing, monitoring, and communicating information. So here's a nice little infographic about the kind of 9 things that risk registers do. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are 2 that I'd really highlight. One is that, as with any risk management tool, ultimately it's all about supporting decision making. I think the mistake people make is to have risk registers, risk appetite statements, risk heat maps, the list goes on, all their materials, all their infrastructure, and they think we're ready. The only point of any of this is to help you make better decisions in the teeth of a crisis, or to make better decisions about how you manage issues in a way that stops them becoming crises. And the second bit is that they are a tool for driving team collaboration as you make decisions. So again, lots of other things that they do, but above all else, it's that thing of team-based collaboration and team-based decision making. So that's what they are and why I have one. How do they work? So here's an example of one that I do with clients. And essentially, it's basically usually a 9-box process. Some people have more things along each axis. But basically, what you are trying to do is to map your main areas of risk against the probability or likelihood of them happening and the reputational and relationship impact if they do. And I'll come back to that difference between reputation and relationships. But what you essentially do is sit down and go through all this, what I call the macro categories of risk, and map them against those axes to see which ones sit in the top right or as close to the top right as possible. Because ultimately, this exercise is not only about mapping, it's also about prioritization. It's about saying which are the ones that we really, really need to be ready for. The second thing, and this is my other obsession, is that people are very good at going, what are our paper risks? What are our risks with governance or finance? And those are sort of very 30,000 feet. What you need to do is to say, how does that risk translate into a real world scenario that might actually happen, which I call micro risk or micro risk scenarios. And I'll come on to examples of that. And this allows you to prepare for the priority scenarios. And I'll talk in a second about how you do that. So that's kind of half of the process piece. And I know, Advita, that CIPR has its own risk register with a similar heat map there. And I think this is a tried and tested tool for all of you as you think about your risk profile at a group, network, or committee level. The other thing, so that's an example of how it works. The other thing, if you're feeling really fancy, is you can then do a spider map and see how those risks evolve over time. Again, I know something that CIPR does, probably a little bit advanced for individual groups, and I don't, that sounded really patronizing and condescending. It didn't. It's just probably time that you don't need to spend. The key is to do the mapping and the prioritization, not just of the risks, but of the real world scenarios. So what are the sorts of categories of risk that we're talking about? So I had a think partly based on some input from CIPR, but actually at a group, network, or committee level, what are the types of categories of risk that you might face at the committee, group, or network level? And for me, and I've put this there as a starter for 10 as opposed to an edict. They're probably around the leadership of the group or the network or the committee and how it works. Obviously, there's a question of reputation. I think there are big issues that I've actually seen to some extent in my own work as an advisor to the Crisis Network around DEI representation, WANLs, MANLs, etc. Really important. I think there are probably conversations to be had around the quality of what you deliver and your performance in doing so, how you drive change and how you use resources. But these really are just my start of 10. I don't know whether, round the room, people think there are glaring other areas that you think at the committee level you think should be on that list. Anyone got any glaring thoughts of what I might have missed or what should be replaced? Or have I covered it?
I think that is really comprehensive, Rod. I think the only thing I also add is maybe around kind of volunteer experience as well.
Yeah.
Which probably comes under kind of representation and DEI, but maybe slightly different. But yeah.
And I think you've nailed it. I think that thing of volunteer experience is, and Vita, you and I have discussed this, is important at both a group level and a CIPR level. CIPR is powered by a volunteer army, and the extent to which volunteers feel involved, engaged, respected, values, I think is really, really important. Sorry, Anne, I think I may have cut across you.
Yeah, no, I just say, it's not enough active committee members to deliver. And we're okay at the moment, but I can see a time when it's probably me doing everything. So is that something that other people relate to?
I can, Anne, definitely.
Yeah.
Me too, as well. I think that is an issue. And also if maybe volunteers leave and maybe good circumstances, etc.
I think the risk is as well, if there is too much pressure on one or two people to deliver everything, they then can't do that over a sustained period of time. Yeah. So then you risk the most proactive person leaving, and then what happens?
Yeah.
What you say there, Lisa, is also a really important fundamental point, is that people tend to treat risks as if they're completely isolated from each other. What you've just exemplified is the fact that all of these risks are, or many of them, can be interrelated. If you have too few people, then that puts pressure on leadership, which impacts delivery and performance, which impacts reputation, which potentially impacts resources, and it becomes a vicious circle. So my other bit of advice is, although you need to be systematic in each bucket of risk, remember that they all play off each other in the real world. So yeah, really good point, Lisa. And then so what you then do, having mapped and prioritized your risks and the scenarios, is you kind of need a simple process for monitoring, tracking, and reviewing how they are going. Are they still the right risks? Are they still the right scenarios? Are any of those risks looking likely to materialize? Are there any opportunities were something to go wrong? I think this is, again, vastly overlooked, that people go, oh no, we're in a crisis, we've got to stop bad shit happening, forgive my French. What is the upside? And if you think in advance about what an opportunity might be from a difficult situation. We had one in the crisis committee where we had, for all sorts of right and wrong reasons, ended up with an all-white, all-male panel. There was a good debate on LinkedIn. It prompted us to rethink the way we approach representation. So again, a really concrete example of how what might look like only containing downside can actually have upside. You need to think about how can you mitigate against and minimize some of those risks, who owns them if you have enough of a group to divide and conquer, and then what content and responses are you going to have in place for dealing with foreseeable risks and risk scenarios. I'll I'm not going to go through all of these, but as I say, the keys to success above all else are being real world, having clear ownership, viewing all of this as a guide to decision making, not just a piece of paper, being really specific in your response plans, reviewing regularly and updating, monitoring and tracking the progress and the evolution of your risks, and where it's appropriate, communicating. So we actually chose, in the case of that representation thing, not to go out and say, here are the lessons that we've learned, but we could have done, and we debated it long and hard. So remembering that because there's opportunity, the communication piece can be powerful. A couple of really practical things, and I've basically borrowed this from my work with clients. I call it the grid, which literally for each major risk scenario gives you a template that says, what is the overall risk category? What's the specific scenario? What are the vulnerabilities and impacts that that could have to your reputation and your relationships? Where are there any potential opportunities? Who owns the scenario and who supports that leader? What measures could you use to mitigate and minimize? If it happened, what's your holding statement, and what's the core Q&A? And if you have got this ready for your 5 top right scenarios, you're in a better place than many organizations who don't do this prep and go, oh, hold on, we haven't done any of this prep, and they're making it up as they go along, and you don't want to do that. The other tool that I use with clients, which looks eye-watering, but it really isn't, is that ultimately people obsess with reputation, and that's fine. You know, we're in the reputation game, but ultimately reputation is what people understand, think, and feel about you. What ultimately matters is how they behave and act as a result. So again, this might be overly complicated at a group level, but effectively this is a way of systematically tracking the relationship impacts of a crisis. Because I find when I do this with clients that they'll go, oh no, our hat's on fire and the world's burning, and you go, okay, yep, the reputation stuff isn't great, but is it actually damaging your key relationships? And very often they go, oh, hold on, we've looked at that and it isn't. So you can then calibrate your response. So I think that reminder that all of this is not just about reputation risk, but fundamentally about relationship risk is really, really important. And this is for me all part of an overall process of being ready. And I'll leave this in the slides. It's a model I built in lockdown called Match Fit, which is a 5-part process for preparing for risk, and then a 5-part process for responding. So that was the practical stuff, which I know is the key thing. Again, any questions? And as I say, I'm sharing this so you can literally nick my tools and use them if you find it helpful. Any questions on that practical stuff? Sarah has one.
Yeah, I just wondered, to get your thoughts actually, Rod, on something that I kind of noticed quite a lot, and what your experience and responses to it. That I quite often find that clients are prone to, in effect, having a bucket of too hard to do or too scary, and scoping out as part of their risk assessment process. So in actual fact, quite often the risk assessment output looks very benign and manageable. And I find that actually the real risks, they're, either unable or unwilling to confront. So in other words, they're literally only willing to consider the things that they can tactically do something about within their own existing processes and procedures.
We're all storytellers, so I'll tell you a story about that to answer your question. I remember doing this exercise with a big global IT firm, and we did the exercise, and a lot of people are very, very focused on operational risk. It's what Oxford Younger at Rupert calls capability, i.e. the things that you do and how you do them. Whereas almost all risk these days is what he calls character risk, which is about behavior, culture, attitude, mindset, as opposed to systems, processes, and structures. So we did the exercise, and the group council stood up and said, so having done this exercise, can you guarantee me that we're prepared for every foreseeable risk? And I was feeling punchy, and I said, well, there's only one circumstance in which I could say yes to that question, which is that if either you or I is God, and I don't believe that to be the truth. So the fact is that you have to be profoundly honest about the human side of this. Most organizations, I remember that conversation when we were talking about, sexual harassment, bullying, etc. And someone literally said, well, I'm godfather to the kids of 3 of the people on the board. They're decent people who would never do this. And 6 months later, one of them had done it. And I basically said, I would be very careful with that thought, because there's now as queer as folk. There's nothing as reliable as human beings making horrible mistakes. So I think you have to be honest, really honest with yourselves, and you have to be profoundly creative. I always view scenario planning as actually quite a fun, creative process, not only to say, what if X happened, but what if X happened and then that triggered Y, Z, Q, and B? Because so often you see it's this weird combination of things that you'd never thought would combine that ends up being, to take my most extreme example that I'll ever work on, the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines flight MH370. Boeing 737s don't disappear in 2014. So I think you have to be very open. There's a great quote about 9/11, is that it wasn't a failure of security, it was a failure of imagination. So you have to be creative, imaginative, and honest. Sorry, that was a typically long answer to a short question, Sarah.
No, it's a very good answer, Rod, and I think one of the things that is quite difficult, even for us within our groups, is to imagine the things that actually make us doubt our ability to fulfil the roles we hold. I think that's one of the key issues.
Great. Any other questions on the practicalities? Mark, you've got your hand up. Hi.
Hi, Rod. Thanks for that. Yeah, that was really detailed and a little bit daunting, to be honest.
Don't be daunted, just be ready.
I guess my observation is just on the practicality of it within our committee groups. So I raised it at one of the previous meetings, and our meetings always run over because we've got a million things to talk about and an hour and a half, maybe sometimes 2 hours to talk about it in. The big issue for me is time. So if you've got any tips for us to just sort of get us started, I mean, I know you've shown us, exemplar way of doing it, but is there something that we could just get into to just start going through the motions with it and making sure that we're doing it?
Do a 9 box, that all the rest will follow. You need to go through the honest, creative process of saying, what are our vulnerabilities, what are our risks, what are the threats, and how might they manifest themselves. And if you've done that and nothing else, then it's a start, and it's more than most people have. The next stage is to start turning that into the grid. But yeah, if you've got an hour on the back of an envelope, do a creative, open, honest conversation about the 9 box.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
The questions. I'm conscious I've gone over my allotted half hour.
Don't worry, Rod, it's fine. I think Avril's got a question, but it's really good stuff and very useful. So thank you.
I've got an observation and a question. So my observation is, Rod, to your point about stakeholders, really, really important, because obviously you can put out fires, and also stakeholders, some of them can be really good allies. So if so-and-so hits the fan and the media goes to stakeholders, you can usually guess who they're going to ring first from the stakeholder perspective. So it's always worth, where you can, briefing them. And then the practical question, which feeds off as well what Helen has put in the chat about how we should work with HQ in a crisis. But I think a lot of the potential scenarios, at least in some, will be exactly the same across groups, and some at least will be very similar, or that the framework will be the same. And I just wonder whether any of it should be done, with a central group to do some of the initial thinking, and then groups can add in their particular challenges if they've got them, because I just think there must be a lot of crossover between the groups of some of these potential issues and crises.
I mean, it's a brilliant point, Avon. I'd start at a collective level. I mean, you know, rather than locking yourselves in rooms as individual groups, you might want to spend an hour as a group saying what as committees, groups, or networks might we commonly see. So yeah, brilliant, Av. I think that's probably your best practical next step.
And that will be our plan, Avril, in the next formal group chairs meeting, to do that as a collective, to put that together. So to Mark's point, we're very conscious of time that everybody has, and there will be crossover, as Rod has also shared. So we will be sharing, I'll bring the kind of key challenges from a HQ, like a CIPR perspective, and then we'll use that and create our kind of groups one, and then you can take that away and add your individual risks to that as well. So this was an opportunity for everybody to kind of get on the same page and understand risk, reputation issues, so everybody understands and can contribute effectively in the next formal group chairs meeting.
Can I show one last? Can I chuck in one last slide, which is just so fundamental to try and get into your minds, which is what I call hold on a second, the crisis iceberg, which is that if I were Prime Minister, which is never going to happen, the first thing I'd legislate to do is to ban the use of the word PR crisis, because in my experience, it barely ever exists. Because ultimately, what we term, or what other people term, a PR crisis is invariably a combination, and I talked about capability and character earlier. It's a combination of things that happen within the organization around operations, operational decisions, structures, leadership, and governance, so the sort of capability stuff, but also about behaviors, individual and collective, culture, values, and ethics, which is the character stuff. And as you do that exercise, Advita, I'd strongly recommend, you know, Rupert Younger's thing of capability versus character, which I've got in the deck, is a really brilliant way of dividing between being the stuff that you do and then how you do it. And I think having that distinction in mind is very important, because people get very, very operationally focused on capability and they forget character. That's the only other thing I wanted to sort of drive home.
No, really, really great points there, Rod. Thank you so much. And Rod, before we sign off, would you be able to share just a little bit more about the report you do? Because it's an absolutely fantastic piece of work, and I think everyone should have a read of it if they haven't done so already. So do you want to just give a couple of lines on what this is and why people should potentially pay attention to it?
If you wish, happily, yes. I've actually got a slide on it, because I'm to prepare for everything. I will remember this. Let me just whip through to that. So basically, I do this report every year for the last 3 years called Reputation, Risk and Resilience. It stemmed from a thought in January 2023 when I was ploughing through 5 global reports ahead of Davos on risk and reputation. And I kind of thought, my God, why has no one ever summarized these? And a little voice in my head went, all right, smartass, why don't you? And I thanked the little voice for ruining the next couple of months of my life. Did that. The reaction was good. So last year I expanded it to 8 reports, and as a result won an EMEA, or didn't win, got a certificate of excellence for agency thought leadership. And because I'm a total masochist, I'm nearly finished with this year's, which is 11 reports globally. I'm really just such a masochist, and that is coming out on the 28th of May. So basically what I do is I do a summary and a TLDR of each report. I have a summary of the 10 key themes that run through all of the reports, and there are 10 practical recommendations for what people should do as a result of the current risk landscape. And this year, I'm delighted to say CIPR is a partner alongside EACD, ICO, Provoke Media, and Ipsos as a sponsor. So it's taken on a bit of a life of its own. As I say, it nearly ends me every year. But I've just about managed to pull through this year. So that comes out at the end of May.
Amazing. And it's absolutely a fantastic piece of work, and credit to you for doing that, because it is a useful guidance for anyone who's involved in the public relations world, whether you work directly in crisis or not. It's well worth reading and adopting some of your guidance and advice. 100%. Well, thank you so much, Rod, for your time today. We really appreciate it. I have found that extremely helpful. And I hope the rest of the folks on the call have. But thank you so much. And if people want to connect with you, the best way, I'm assuming, is on LinkedIn. And it's only LinkedIn now, really. Then you're on Blue Sky, maybe Blue Sky as well, if you're floating about on
Blue
there.
Sky, but it's kind of quiet. So yeah, LinkedIn is the place
LinkedIn.
to be. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank
and
you.
obviously,
Thank you so much.
In this space, the crisis comms network that Sarah and I are part of, we've gone from nothing to how many members, Sarah? It's gone a bit nuts in the last 3 years. We've got this amazing.
Yeah, it's gone nuts. Yeah. It's I think it's about 1,000 something, isn't it?
Yeah, and we've done 2 skills guides. We've got an amazing blog. We've got an incredible events program. So if this is your bag, then get involved. Never miss an opportunity to sell. There we go.